Hello everyone. This year I thought I would make more unscripted videos so that I have more time to focus on other work I need to get done. The only problem I have is with my microphone, which sometimes shuts off automatically. So if you notice that the sound quality sometimes changes, it's because the microphone shut off and I'm using the sound in the camera to fill in the silence. But anyway, in preparation for this, I have attempted to summarize the entire education or philosophical work on a single page, just to have a brief overview in case I forget something. Of course, I still have a lot of notes for the details. And so I'm not sure what to talk about in this first video, but perhaps I should just summarize. And these notes are written in Swedish, so you probably can't read what I've written, but it doesn't matter. This is mainly, I don't think anyone else could make much sense of this, except for me anyway. So what is my work? It's I call it timeless education. But you can also call it a wisdom or evaluation compass. And there are many places I could start from, depending on what people are interested in. Since everything is connected, it is usually possible to connect some subject to timeless education. But in this case, when I'm sitting here just trying to summarize the entire thing, it can sometimes be a bit difficult to know exactly where to start. But I suppose the best way to start is with the formula alpha omega chi omega, which is a synthesis of the entire teaching, and is based on the same principles that was used in ancient times to summarize the original metaphysics. And the most common expression of that was probably through the four classical elements: fire, water, air, and earth. And the symbols alpha, omega, chi, omega in my formula are analogous to that, to keep up the tradition of these perennial principles that all, I guess you could call it spirituality, derived from. And so I like to focus a lot on theory, since I feel that is often missing from spirituality. And this has caused spirituality and philosophy to sort of go their separate paths, and it has become a split, and a lot of people are teaching from authority, from imitation, from dogma. I feel that imitation is probably the best word, since a lot of people are aware of the problem with dogma and with authority, and yet still there is something often superficial about how people approach spirituality, and the way they practice is of course part of the essence of spirituality, but it easily becomes that the practice becomes very one-sided, because there is no overarching theory that shows you exactly what needs to be worked on, so people just work on one thing. So I consider that sort of a problem. Now, I have talked a lot about the theory in my videos up to this point, so of course I need to get into the practice, but it is important to understand that part of the practice is to learn, to study, because you need to practice your intelligence, you need to practice your mind. Of course, that's one of, I guess you could call it one of 5 main areas that you need to work on yourself. One is to acquire the right knowledge, the essential knowledge, the beneficial knowledge, I'm not sure what to call it. Because today we live in such a complex world that we are accumulating more and more history and information that we cannot learn everything. So we must have some kind of orientation, some kind of something that focuses on the essential and how things are tied together, rather than simply just learn everything without discrimination. Because if we do that, we will not learn the things that are essential. And the more we accumulate throughout history, the more famous philosophers and spiritual teachers and religions and all of this stuff, the more we keep needing to learn, and yet we can't do that. We need to focus on the basics, on the essentials, and that is why I have come up with the idea of timeless education, that focus on things that are timeless, that are essential. Because what's timeless is of course essential. In the beginning, I called it essential education, but when I searched for essential education in Google, there was a lot of stuff coming up. But when I put in timeless education, there was less stuff, and it was easier to find my stuff. So that's why I went with timeless education. I mean, I had trouble knowing what to call my teaching or my philosophy, if you will. I couldn't just call it alpha, omega, chi, omega, because that sounded too cryptic or esoteric and jargony. But timeless education, it gives people, I think it gives people an idea of what I'm about, so to speak. Microphone is still recording. Very good. So, yeah, the 4 basic principles are that everything is connected. And that is a very important point from which you can learn a lot. Yeah, if you're going to reduce things to their essence, you also need to part of that involves everything being connected, so that it is because everything is connected that you can reduce everything into some kind of basic principle or a brief series of principles that can explain everything and keep your attitude centered in a foundational worldview that is relevant to most things, so to speak. And of course, everything is connected, everything is polarized or contrasted, so that and this is part of the principle of non-duality, that you need opposites, because nothing can exist without its opposite. When something forms, its opposite also forms, like the shadow appearing. And in order to be able to discriminate, in order to be able to define anything, you need to contrast it with its opposites. And I think that's why analysis and reasoning is referred to as dialectics. Because the way you discriminate and analyze is to separate things from each other, which is part of the principle of contrasts. And then the third principle is cycles, which is also related to movement. Everything moves, nothing stays still. And of course, this is related to time and so on. But of course, what is time and how does things move is perhaps something that we cannot know with certainty. But the fact that things are moving is, of course, the basics of life and consciousness and experience. Because if everything was frozen, everything would be dead, so to speak. And then the fourth principle is analogy, which is again, it is part of the first principle, that everything is connected, that everything is like an echo that has the same principles or the same laws reappear in all kinds of things. Paradoxes must be reconciled, so that things are both the same and yet discriminate, so to speak. We need to have both of these both of these principles into consideration. But rather than saying that everything is the same, I think it's better to say that everything is interconnected. Because what does it mean when we say that everything is the same? Sometimes I feel that people take this too far, and regardless of whether or not it is accurate to, so to speak, smash things together, there doesn't seem to be much use for it. Sometimes knowledge is too much confused with wisdom. And so this is also something that you can organize according to numbers. So you have the number 4 for this formula. And within this formula you also have the number 3, or the first 4 numbers, 1, 2 and 3. And of course 1, what does 1 symbolize? It obviously symbolizes oneness. Because of one thing, everything is one. But again, I prefer the term interconnection, everything is connected. The number 2, of course, is polarity or duality, that things are not just one, are not just connected, but they are also contrasted so that you can discriminate. And so it is relevant to take this into consideration, that we need to the way I define non-dualism is that everything is that you appreciate and understand the necessity of both parts. Dualism is when you focus too much on only one side of the polarity, or are trying to reduce everything to one side of the polarity. So the most common example is when it comes to consciousness. Materialists will reduce everything to matter, to the point that consciousness sometimes is only viewed as an illusion. And the opposite of that is when everything is reduced merely to consciousness, so that matter becomes somewhat trivialized. The only thing that matters is consciousness. And there arises this idea that you can even shape reality however you want, because it doesn't really exist. Everything is just in your head, and that too is dualism, because it places the focus on only one thing, on the polarity, so to speak. So matter and consciousness, the way I approach it is that both needs to be regarded with a certain kind of reverence, I suppose you could say. And that both are in some sense illusory as well. Obviously we know from physics that matter is somewhat illusionary, that it is not, there is no such thing as an actual substance. Everything is electricity, electromagnetism and motion and all of this. And consciousness, no, people, when people think of consciousness, they think of something like, free will and imagination, freedom of imagination and things like that. But consciousness is actually, even though we are conscious beings, people assume too much that we actually are as conscious as we could be. Most people, live in daydreams and are just repeating in their head information that they have received externally. So that there is a kind of causal mechanism to consciousness, a causal mechanism to ideas, so that there is something mechanic about consciousness. Now we can of course perhaps rise above this mechanical consciousness, so that we actually achieve real consciousness, and part of that is part of spiritual work, to rise above mechanical consciousness to actual free, alive consciousness that is truly creative, that can truly go against mere reactivity, that makes us something more than merely mediums for ideas. So again, those are things that ought to be taken into consideration within this philosophical framework that I refer to as a wisdom compass or timeless education. So yeah, one thing I talked about, various dimensions to work on, or parts of the psyche, and one of them is of course education and study, and that's that's the development of knowledge, and that's the intellectual sphere, so to speak. And then there is of course the emotional sphere. We also need to train. I call it self-control. I mean, it can also be called love. It is linked to love and related to love. But love, again, in order to understand that love does not come automatically, because if love is merely reactive, then it is again kind of useless. It is easy to love people who treat us good. It is easy to love that which our biological inclination has taught us to love. And when we have a crush on someone, that also seems to happen just automatically. We do not choose to have a crush on someone. And this is what I'm talking about when I say that our consciousness is somewhat mechanical and not truly free, not truly alive. So in order to develop things like through actual compassion and actual love, you need to develop your will, and that is part of resisting negative emotion and forming new attitudes that are able to make it easier to endure and change your attitude towards things that are happening, so that you don't just react with anger and frustration and without free will in that sense. So the emotional sphere, working on your emotions, has a lot to do with working on self-control. And related to this is working with your energies. And of course your biological energies needs to flow freely. This is also related to what people refer to as the chakras and things like that. And this is related to being natural and authentic. And this can be difficult to explain to people, because I talk about liberating your natural energy, and a lot of people are kind of suspicious of human nature and of being completely natural. They think of people becoming savages or something. But you need in order to have a healthy body, you cannot control yourself too much. You need to have your energies run free, not have a bunch of energetic blockages. And the more you are able to express yourself freely and be yourself, the more you will feel satisfied. You will feel like you have substance and not just live in your head and imagine things you want to do, because then you will feel more hungry, you will have more desires, and more delusions will pop up into your head of what you need to do in order to be satisfied. But if you are actually expressing yourself, liberating your energies, letting the energy flow freely through your body, then you will feel more satisfied, so that you will also need less, and you will become less selfish and less savage, so to speak. So there's a kind of another reconciliation of opposites there, where you integrate yourself, so that the more you liberate your energies, the more you are yourself, the more functional you become, so that you actually, in the beginning you might be expressing a lot of frustration and a lot of I guess you could use the word pathology if you use the psychoanalytical jargon. Or if you want to use the Orthodox religion, you could say that you will express a lot of your sin, a lot of your sinful nature, or a lot of the devil in you, or whatever. But the more you do that, the more you become more calm, and you become more functional in this, and you will become less pathological, or less sinful, or less of a devil, or less unconscious, because I prefer the word unconscious over evil. I find this word to be somewhat accusatory, and accusation is a part of dualistic aggression, and it's the origin of the word devil. It means accusation, so that can be something to keep in mind. So unconsciousness is how I tend to view it, or dysfunctionality. And obviously, if a machine doesn't have the electricity going properly through it, the machine doesn't work. And the same thing is with human beings. We need to be functional, and that's why we need. And this is related to the fourth level, that is, our biological level, our basic needs. We need food, water, nourishment, and shelter, and all of this, because people are not going to be able to concentrate on developing themselves. They are not going to care about things like morality or reason or anything if they do not have basic needs. And today people are. It's becoming more and more difficult to acquire basic needs. We need money, and so we need to work, and it causes stress, and we don't have enough time to focus on what we want or who we are, or and all this stuff. That modern society is interfering with our nature, and so this comes to the economical level. And this, how do you work with this? Well, you can work with physical exercises, eating healthy and all this stuff. I'm not going to focus too much on that, because there are already other channels that teaches you how to attain a healthy body, a healthy diet, and all this stuff. But one thing that I am interested in is developing some kind of idea of how to create a social system that actually benefits human being and creates more functional human beings. So that is, again, it's not a practice exactly, but we need to also take into consideration and not trivialize this idea that we need to improve the world, improve our societies and social systems. Because if you only try to improve human beings but not improve society, then things will not progress well. And the same is if you do the opposite. If you only focus on changing society and improving society and hoping that humans will improve just because you improve society, that usually doesn't work either. You also need to have an attitude of personal human development, so to speak, so that you acquire functional human beings who are rational and authentic, natural, and ethical, so to speak. And the fifth level that you need to work on is what we might refer to as the spiritual level proper, which is becoming in contact with our deeper self, which is the actual awareness that is the ground, or the ontological ground of our existence or being, the knower behind our thoughts, so to speak. And this is, of course, again, something that you can find in a lot of teachings, and a lot of gurus, spiritual gurus online will talk about this. So again, this is not something that is it's a huge part of timeless education, but I feel that I often feel like I need to emphasize on the other dimensions more, because those spiritual gurus that tend to focus on the inner knower and developing non-attached awareness, they miss some of the other dimensions, and that's why I focus a lot more on those. And that might make it seem like I am not as spiritual as other teachings, because I focus on theory and on more or psychological components like human types, but it's because I want to balance the typical tendency of spiritual teachers to merely focus on the consciousness, the awareness behind the thoughts. So that is that's the basic overview on what to work on what the aim is, so to speak, with this program or teaching that I am attempting to convey. And then, of course, I have some. I have a lot of personal interests, things that interest me, and that I also think are very useful to this teaching that I like to, touch on as well, such as the psychology of various human types, but also on things like what is the cause behind evolution, and how is the universe structured, that are in some ways a kind of work in progress. It's an exploration, how that is sort of related to things like physics, but I do not specialize in that. But I will talk a bit more about that stuff, because I find a lot of these things interesting, and I think that we need something that when we look at things and how things are connected, and I regard myself more of a philosopher than a spiritual guru or something like that, and philosophy is concerned with how things are connected, to get an all-inclusive overview of all of our sciences and religions and arts and all of this stuff. So when you have scientists and people are interested in science, they tend to be specialized, and so they focus on one thing, like for example biology or the theory of evolution, or they focus on physics, or they focus on something else like history. But because they are so specialized, they often cannot. There are things that cannot be reconciled, because there are things that are contradictory between different sciences. And when I notice that, I feel like I need to come up with some kind of alternate explanation. Something that because what it likely means is that if you cannot reconcile all the sciences, then that probably means that some of them are incorrect, maybe all of them. And the way to really, what I consider to be the best approach to have a true science and also true religion and true spirituality is to have all of them be connected, so that they explain more or less the same thing. You cannot have, if everything is split up, you get this kind of conflict and people arguing over religion versus science and all of this stuff. And to create a sane culture, you need to have unity of science and religion, of art and philosophy and politics and economics and everything. If spirituality is to mean anything, it needs to be everything, so to speak. Because another problem when things are too separate is that people will be a politician, or they will be an engineer or something, and then they just leave their soul up to something else, like the church or some spiritual guru, and then they go and visit them occasionally, and then they do not take it. There's a risk that they don't take it as seriously, and things easily become sort of trivialized, like that's just another part of my life. The main part is science, or the main part is sports or economics or something like that. And yet it all needs to be, every part of your life needs to in some sense be endowed with this kind of spiritual awareness. And of course I define spirituality as essentialness. Everything needs to be sort of oriented and related to this idea of the essence of things, so that and of having a kind of unity in your mind and unity in your culture, and also preferably unity between cultures, so that you don't have this excessive conflicts and exploitation between various nations and parts of the world, so to speak. So there's a lot to talk about, and this is just I have not even touched upon everything that I have written on my one paper that is to be an overview, but there will be more that I will talk about, and I imagine that these videos will probably be somewhat longer than before, since I am now speaking more spontaneously and without a script. So let's see how it goes. Let's see what you think of this.